Okay, well, Jim Cummins is a retired stream and river ecologist. He spent most of his career working on water quality and fish in the Potomac River Basin. He was director of the Living Resources of the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin for 28 years, and he focused on biological assessment of streams, habitat restoration, and fish passages. He was very instrumental in the efforts to restore the shad populations on the Potomac and other East Coast rivers. He's probably the area's expert on the history of shad and shad fisheries in the region. He's received, among many other awards, he's received the Field and Stream Magazine's Hero of Conservation Award. And I'm going to let Jim take the program over from here. Jim, go ahead.
Great. And thank you for that introduction, Tom. And I'm very excited to be here. I've got 25 years of work on American shad, and I've got to consolidate it down to, I'm going to try to do it in an hour or so. There's going to be a break about 35 minutes into this, so don't get too antsy. You'll get a little break. I started doing talks on shad 25 years ago, and it's evolved quite a bit. This may be the last time I give this talk. I don't know, but I'm really excited about providing you all at Friends of Mason Neck, because Mason Neck has a very important part of shad history, and it means a lot to me too, from having worked off of Mason Neck for most of those 25 years. As I said, I retired in 2016, but I've continued to be involved with shad restoration, both on the Potomac, as I mentioned earlier, and also I'm working on the Brandywine Creek tributary to the Delaware River in Wilmington, Delaware. But let me proceed. And there's probably about a half a second delay from when I talk and when you see it, but I hope that doesn't have much of an effect. On this slide on the left, well, let me start with the American shad. I call it a forgotten fish because it was once the most abundant fish coming into the bay. It's the world's largest herring. It's in the herring family, but it's the world's largest. It ranges from Florida on up into Maine. This time of year, it's down off of the Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina coast. Some of the shad have already gone into the St. Johns River in Florida back in December and January. They go in there and spawn. And then as the Gulf Stream warms up, they start moving upstream, and the different shad peel off into their natal rivers, the rivers they were spawned in. American shad has about a 99% river fidelity. They go back to the river they were spawned in. Almost all of them do. So the general population has been down off of the coast there, but now as the waters are warming and it's moving north, the fish peel off, as I said, into their natal rivers. They enter the Chesapeake Bay, which is sort of the entrance of all of the natal rivers for the Chesapeake Bay. And about March, in a little bit, they'll be coming into the Chesapeake Bay. They arrive in the James in March, and then they arrive in the Potomac, sometimes at the Potomac in March, but usually it's beginning of April on into mid-May. And then they spawn in these tributaries, and then after they're finished spawning up in the mid-Atlantic area, they're repeat spawners, so they'll leave, swim down out of the Chesapeake Bay, and then go back, and they head north. And almost all the shad on the East Coast are up in Canada in August. And then when the water starts cooling down, they head back down south. And the young of the year come out to join them. And, they are having summers up in Canada and winters down in Florida and vicinity. Gotta admit, it's a pretty good strategy. And they spend about 90% of their life, though, in the ocean. They come into the freshwaters to spawn, but they spend most of their life in the ocean. When they come into the freshwaters to spawn, there's a great physiological change that happens. They have to change from a saltwater fish to a freshwater fish. What's the big difference? Well, in saltwater, salt water is saltier than our bodies, and fish gills especially, the salt water wants to absorb the water out of the bodies of the shad, so their cell walls have to keep water in. When they enter the fresh water, it's the opposite. They're saltier than the freshwater, so their bodies want to absorb water, so they have to physiologically change the cells of their gills, especially to prevent water from coming in. They also don't feed when they're spawning. They don't eat at all. They will not eat for about 2 months. They survive on their reserves fat to begin with, and when they're out migrating, they start to resorb any of the reproductive tissue that they didn't expend. Some of them do die from spawning even in the mid-Atlantic. Down in Florida, they all just spawn one time and die. And as you start moving northward, they get repeat spawning, and they'll repeat spawn in the Chesapeake Bay 4 or 5 times or more. Now I've gone to a slide that's showing the Chesapeake Bay drainage with the Potomac watershed in white up on the upper left, and the Potomac watershed, a larger map on the right. Want to call your attention to a couple of items there. I'm hoping you can see my cursor all right. I'll start with the Chesapeake Bay, which is outlined with this blue line, and then the Potomac watershed's in white. Potomac watershed kind of it flows from the west to the east, but in an arc. The James River, for a little bit difference, it's most of the rivers on the East Coast pretty much go from the west, and they flow eastward, and that you have in the James River, York, Rappahannock. And as you get to the Potomac, there's a bend, and then rivers start to move from north to south, like the Susquehanna River flows from New York on down into the Chesapeake Bay. Delaware, similarly, you get this north to south drainage above the Potomac. Potomac's kind of unusual for all the rivers in the East Coast because it has a very short portion of free-flowing river. In other words, you have the tidal river, and then when the water reaches that fall line from being a free-flowing river to tidal area, in many rivers, they have hundreds of miles that they'll swim in the free-flowing section. The James River, they'll go from basically Richmond, which is where my cursor is pointing now, and they've used to go on up to Covington, Virginia, which is west of I-81. They don't go there anymore because of dams that are in Richmond. On the Susquehanna, they used to go from the tidal river, which is basically about just a little bit below the Maryland-Pennsylvania state line, and then they would swim all the way, they'd spawn all the way up through Pennsylvania and up into New York to spawn. That's about 300 miles of spawning habitat. Well, on the Potomac River, the tidal river runs up to the western boundary of the District of Columbia, right there near Chain Bridge. And then there's only about a 10-mile area upstream from that fall line at the district line to Great Falls. And Great Falls is the barrier to shad migration, and it's been the barrier to shad migration for tens of thousands of years. So it's a little bit different than most rivers in that short tidal stretch. The Potomac is almost 15,000 square miles, the second largest river in the Chesapeake Bay, the fourth largest on the East Coast. Over 6 million people live here. 80% of them live in the Washington metropolitan area, and most of them rely on the Potomac for their source of drinking water. Shad are a filter feeder. I'm showing a picture now. I think you might have gotten it. I'm looking down a shad's mouth on the right, and they're interesting plankton are but mostly microscopic or small, and the shad have evolved the forepart of their gills, the gill rakers they're called, to serve as a net, and that helps them to catch the plankton. They'll go through the water with the mouths open and they'll catch the plankton. Not very much different than the largest animals on the planet, the baleen whales. Here's a humpback whale, and you see the baleen next to its tongue that is used to filter out plankton. So you think, well, eating plankton, you can't be very big. No, it's the largest animal in the world eats plankton, and shad aren't that. Their shad, average size of shad's about 2 feet, a little bit over 2 feet in length. William Strachey, who was in Jamestown, friend of William Shakespeare's, but William Strachey described shad as being 3 feet down in Jamestown when they were first there. The world record hook and line shad, which that started, less than 100 years ago, is a 2'6" shad, pretty big shad, but not 3 feet, and weighed 12 pounds. But their food is plankton. So they're deriving, as I said, they live 90% of their life in the ocean. Almost all the protein that they have on their body, all the protein on their body is ocean derived, energy. And the bay, we talk about nutrients. Well, it's important to think about where the energy comes from that runs the ecosystem as well. So throughout their journey, shad are very important to the ecosystem, not just the ocean, but also the rivers. In the ocean, up in the right there, you see the dolphin. It's a primary food. Shad are a primary food of dolphin. Shad are the only fish found yet that can hear the echolocation of the dolphin. So they kind of co-evolved predator-prey relationship. The dolphin had to, evolve the echolocation to find him. The shad evolved to be able to hear him and avoid him. Down below on the right, you see a cod. When I talk to biologists nowadays that work on cod, they say, we never find any shad in cod. Well, you go back into the 1800s, the U.S. Fish Commission was created in 1877. The earlier reports talk about how the shad and herring were very important to the cod. That the demise of cod that they were seeing in the late 1800s was due to the demise of shad and river herring. When the U.S. Fish Commission was created in 1877, it had 3 tasks, one of which was to inventory all the water resources. I hear noise from somebody. Maybe there's somebody has a microphone on. If you please turn that off, it'd help me. Thank you. But they had 3 tasks. One is to inventory all the water resources, fresh and saltwater resources of the United States, a big task. Second task was, well, they saw already in the late 1800s that the cod were declining. So what's causing the demise of cod? And the third task was, we're seeing that the shad are being reduced. What's causing shad to be reduced? Well, Spencer Baird, the head of the U.S. Fish Commission, said the demise of cod was due to the demise of shad and herring. And because that was one of the cod's principal food, and the shad and herring were declining, principally from loss of habitat, because in the early 1800s, you had the canal building, and they were building dams across the rivers to supply water to those canals, so that the shad and river herring numbers were declining. But as the shad enters the bay, there's another, I've got the blue crab down there. I had to include that. It's food for a lot of fish, but I'm sort of highlighting some. So I did mention some of these shad die. So the blue crab would eat the shad that don't make it. So they were helping the blue crab population. Birds of prey, ospreys and eagles. You guys are great fans of eagles. I probably don't need to tell you this, but the eagles are building their nest and laying their eggs in sometimes January and February, so that the eggs hatch. They're timed for these fish migrations, shad being an important one. So when we're talking about restoring shad, we're helping to restore these other species. Rockfish feed on, the striped bass feeds on the adult shad, and then in different life stages, because the young rockfish are in the rivers the same time as the young shad, so the young rockfish are eating the young shad. Predatory fish like the smallmouth bass also eat the young shad. But the most important predator of all the fish in the rivers is the smallest one, the minnows. Minnows are the biggest predators to shad and herring in the river because they eat the eggs and larvae. So these fish come in mass, in huge masses. They don't really build any nest or take care of their young. They just deposit their eggs. The females stream them out, the males fertilize them in the water, and the fertilized eggs fall to the floor and hatch in a week or so. But the eggs themselves and the fry are big food for minnows. So the shad need to overwhelm the predatory base, this minnow base, if they're going to be successful. Shad do bite at minnows. A lot of shad anglers use minnow lures, minnow-like lures. But again, shad don't eat anything. The reason that they're biting at those lures is they're basically trying to keep the minnows from eating their eggs, to sort of some little bit of parental guardianship that they're doing there. There's a lot of history with shad. It goes way back. I'm starting up at the upper left on this picture, showing a petroglyph carved in the rocks up at Great Falls. Image of it done by the Park Service. Over to the right, it's interpreted to be a herring or probably a shad. By the way, the picture below that is a picture in a rock cave in Spain of the herring coming into nearby in that location. I won't go into that story, it's too long to tell. We don't have any surviving photographs of the early Americans fishing, but Edward Curtis took these pictures of the Hoopa Indians out in the West using these long dip nets that they created to harvest the shad. Either, you know, they concentrate with a barricade to keep the fish concentrated, or on the far right, they'll dip down and just sort of scoop them up as the fish follow the bank heading upstream. The picture below that shows some more recent folks. These are 1912 shad dippers up at Great Falls. They use a big hoop net to reach down and grab the shad. And over to the far left, you see anglers up there fishing at Great Falls. They could have been catching rockfish who make it up there as well now, and but also American shad. The early peoples relied a lot on fishes, and shad was certainly important to them. Some of the fishing techniques that they would use, these are from John White's drawings of the coast of North Carolina, but it's very similar to what happened in the Chesapeake Bay. In the tidal stretches, they had pound nets, basically a net that went to shore. Fish would come up and bump into that. They moved down and find a hole, but that got them into little pounds, little chambers where they could be collected. The Indians in this picture are harvesting other species as well, but that's the way it's done in the tidal river today, from 301 Bridge South. And then upstream in the free-flowing part of the river, they use these rock and wood weirs. The river's flowing from right to left, and the fish will get in those weirs and they'll be concentrated and they're harvested that way. Below that picture, that drawing, you'll see this is a satellite image looking down at the river. That's the Maryland shoreline, and you'll see that V shape in the river there. That's an old weir that probably was originally built by the Native Americans that were here. That weir is real close to the town of Brunswick, Maryland, which in pioneer days was called Eel Town, because they had, there's about 6 weirs in that location, and the Native Americans were harvesting eel. In the free-flowing Potomac, the largest native predatory fish in the Potomac River was the American eel. And the eels would out-migrate. They do the opposite of the herrings. They come in as small elvers, little 4-inch long eel-looking things, and go up into far up into the rivers until they grow up to be 3.5 feet long back in those days, and then they'd out-migrate. They spawn in the Sargasso Sea, and the Indians would capture them. But, you know, again, the shad and herring and all the migratory fish, other than eels in the Chesapeake Bay, only go up to these fall lines, or where the waterfall would prevent them from going upstream naturally, or now dams prevent them. But on the Potomac main stem below Great Falls, this is another satellite image, and this is the Virginia shorelines over here on the upper right, and you can't see the shoreline on the left, the Maryland shoreline. That's where Cabin John Creek comes in. You see the scale, you see this airliner, so that's about 250 feet. But if you follow my cursor down, you'll see a weir located down there. Can everybody see the weir with my cursor all right? Somebody would have to put a mute. I can't see you all. I'm only seeing my screen. But there's the weir, and the river's flowing in the same direction as the airliner. So that's where they would be harvesting them. But what's interesting about this weir is if you follow it upstream, you'll see there's an apex facing upstream that's barely seeable, but it's there. And that's because this is downstream of Great Falls, so the shad will be coming up this, and they're captured there, and then after they spawn, they'd be going out, they're captured in both directions. I'm pretty certain that along the shoreline here, either on the Virginia side, or I think more likely on the Maryland side, was a seasonal village for those Native Americans as they harvest these fish. Now you have to think about how important the shad migration is to these people, because the shad are coming up early spring when your larders, your food resources from your agriculture last year are at their lowest. You've gone through your stored food from last year's harvest. You know, you might have been able to get some deer, but the Jamestown colonists describe how the Indians were pretty starved out, and pretty thin come spring. So when these shad arrived, it was a very much a celebratory time as this fresh fish came upstream, and they were able to it meant it was life-saving. It wasn't just, oh, this is good to eat. It really saved their lives. And that was true up until the 1900s, with our parents and grandparents, great-grandparents and beyond really relied on these fish. It was a big event. I'm old enough, I'm 70. When I was a kid, we had shad every spring. When I ask people, and that's what I can't do in this kind of setting, was online, but when I give these talks, I ask people to raise their hands, and almost everyone that raises their hands are my age or older that have eaten shad, because again, their numbers got so low that they just weren't a food item for many people. But they were also important to the new Americans that arrived. They're called the founding fish by historian and author John McPhee. And their species name, again, their genus is Alosa, meaning they're a herring, as I've already mentioned, but their species name is Sapodisma, which means savory, or more, to us, it's delicious. They're delicious fish. They got that name. When you're named delicious, it's going to be tough on you. George Washington had a shad fishery at Mount Vernon that kept it viable. It wasn't just we had this thing that brought in some income. He would have gone bankrupt if it hadn't been for his fishery. Again, shad fishery being the main one. In 1778 at Valley Forge, if you've ever been to visit Valley Forge, you might have heard, they were there, they were starving. And then the shad arrived, and they went out in the Schuylkill River and smacked their swords in the water and captured these shad. Well, that's the legend. The real fact of the matter was the British, who occupied Philadelphia, which is where the Schuylkill runs through, they had blocked off the Schuylkill River with nets. George Washington, being as wise as he was, and it was called the Valley Forge Congress, the guys that ran the thing, they thought because the British were in Philadelphia, where the Schuylkill runs through up to Valley Forge, they said they might do something. We better bring shad from some other area. So they brought shad by wagons, came and saved the troops at Valley Forge. They did eat shad. They came by wagons from parts of the Delaware River, upper river, but also from the Potomac. They came up from the Potomac and fed the troops. That's in Valley Forge Fish Story, a very interesting document that came out in 1999. And I love this painting by James Wharton showing a shad fishery. They're deploying the net right off of Mount Vernon. And that's, I just like that picture. But the shad commercial fishing operations in the Potomac and the rest of the Chesapeake Bay were the region's most important fisheries up until the early 1900s. It was more important, it got more money than crabs, more money than oysters, more money than any other fish. It was the moneymaker. And the fishery for it, when I say fishery, that's how they were collecting the fish. It grew in complexity when the Industrial Revolution kind of kicked in. You went from sort of these hull seines to drawn in by hand to these machine-powered devices. The picture on the lower left there, that's the Maryland shoreline over at the Chapman Fishery. Those trees on the other bank, this is Mason Neck right over here. Because Chapman Fishery is right across the river from you. All probably know that, but just for anybody in the audience that doesn't know that, it's just right across the river from Mason Neck. And he had these big devices to haul in and employed a lot of people. There they are preparing the shad, and had a horse-drawn winch to reel in the big net. It was very important. He made $10,000 in 1816, one year. $10,000 in 1816 is a whole lot of money nowadays. So it's very important. Here's some images from the early on years ago. The one up on the upper right is the Anacostia River up in DC. That's the Navy Yard in the background. And there you also see this a horse-drawn net being drawn in, and they're harvesting shad. There is the Notch Tank Indians, the Anacostia Indians used to have a fishery there. Typically they're using haul seines, like over here on the upper left. They would deploy it from the shore in a big loop. They were smaller back then, and I'll get into their size that they got to be. Down below on the bottom right, you'll see a steam-powered fishery at Stony Point, Potomac River, and watermen working there. And on the lower left, they've harvested these. This is a picture also taken in the Potomac. It's harvesting the fish as they're getting ready to clean them and prepare them. When I started finding these, I spent years and I found these old photographs. And one of the things I noticed on these pictures, most of them labeled Stony Point, Potomac River, is that the watermen are almost all black. They're African-American heritage. And I learned that up until about the early 1900s, from Delaware south, almost all the watermen were black, 95% estimated to be the number of watermen. And during slavery days, that was the work that the slaves did or the freemen did. And there's an interesting history. That's just one of the facets of this shad history. Although I've got this slide up, the shad boat you see there were 24 oars. There are 24 oarsmen that brought this net out, had a lantern on it to light up because they go out at dusk and into night, so they have to mark where they are so they're not run into by other boats. And then this empty spot at the stern of the boat was where they placed the net and would deploy the net in a big arc. But the black watermen are
Yeah.
story. Yes.
Could I
Yes.
ask, you mentioned Stony Point. Could you explain where Stony Point is, please?
I will get to that.
You get there. Good.
And
Okay.
now, and I'm glad you've commented, because I was wondering if anybody was hearing me all right. So good. And if you could hold your questions to the break and towards the end, that would be great. Unless there's something you just got to ask, because I'm going to get into a lot of stuff, and if I digress, it'll take me a pretty long time. I can spend hours on each one of these slides. I just want to let you know, I also give a talk on American shad and the black waterman, a heritage nearly forgotten, and that's part of Mason Neck history. These images, you see the upper right when they're going out there, you see if you count those oars, you would count 12 oars on each side, and these watermen are taking the photographers out for these 1890s pictures, and apparently the photographers were bringing some gals with them. One thing to think about, so they're coming out to take these pictures. They didn't arrive by car to take these pictures. They arrived by horse carriage to take these pictures in 1890. This is how a fishing technique, the bottom right, this is a Susquehanna River, but this is basically the same way on the Potomac. Started in the 1890s, the shore haul seine technology changed to where they had drift gill nets, where the guys would go out in a small boat and put a drift gill net out, a lantern floating on a plank would mark where the one end of the net is, and the waterman would be up here. And that became the primary way that shad were harvested from the 301 bridge up to DC area. This picture on the left, there's some young people, as I'll talk about them some more. They're getting out and relearning about American shad and their heritage. So let's see. So you've captured the shad, now they're being processed. So the way this slide works, wonderful slide here, but over in the bottom right, they're bringing in the shad, putting them in tubs where they're cleaning them, scaling them, cleaning them, and then they rack them up on racks, and then these gentlemen carry the racks of fish up into this building and hang them, and then they're smoked for hours. I don't really know the recipe, but when I smoke fish, it takes me about 4 hours, but they might have smoked them longer. And then they take the fish down and put them in barrels with salt. Again, this is before refrigeration, so they were salting the fish in those barrels. That's quite a smoker there. I calculated counting the fish in this one column and then multiplying that by 6 columns, I get about 1,500 fish just in that one layer. I don't know how deep that building is, but if it was 30 feet, just 30 feet deep, that'd be 45,000 shad being smoked at one time. That's a smoker. But the shad was noted as being remarkably abundant in the Potomac River, maybe more than anywhere else. Spencer Baird, I mentioned earlier, the first director of the U.S. Fish Commission, in his 1886 report says, no better illustration of the numbers in which migratory fish enter the rivers can be given than a presentation of the case as it relates to the Potomac River and the short distance between its mouth and the Great Falls of the Potomac. An estimated 22.5 million shad were harvested in the Potomac River in 1832. They used approximately 1 million barrels to salt and cure those fish. Okay, that many barrels, if you were to stack them up, that would make, if you got out on a football field, a full, end zone, 360 feet long, 160 feet wide, they would stack up to 300 feet. That's quite a pyramid. just to give you an idea, I found this picture taken in the 1950s of the 4th of July preparations ceremony for a barrel burning in Salem, Massachusetts. It was a bad era for wooden barrels. As they were getting rid of them, I guess. They burned them and had a big bonfire. So this stack is described as 100 feet high and 30 feet wide at the base. I think it's wider at the base, but they said 30 feet. Well, that stack of barrels with 1 million barrels, that would be 3 times taller than that stack, 5 times wider, and 12 times longer. So just think about that stack of barrels, because that's giving you, the reason I'm talking about that is because that provides you an idea of the secondary economies of the shad fishery. That is, the barrels alone were the work of a lot of woodsmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, coopers, colliers, wagon masters, teamsters, people taking care of horses, mules, etc. There's a lot of, there were about 8,000 people employed to harvest the fish, and then you had all these other secondary economies. It was a very important economy to the area. And according to the annual reports of the C&O Canal, the barrels of salted shad and herring brought the largest income on the upstream when the canal boats moved back upstream. Shad roe is a desired product. Nowadays, you can get a set of roe, the paired sacks of eggs for $14, $17 is a typical price nowadays. But the flesh, as I mentioned, is also appreciated. It's how it got its name. And one of the ways of cooking them is planking. Attaching them to a plank in front of a fire pit and baking them. Really, it's baking. It's not really smoking. It's a baking method. Here you see this upper picture is a picture taken at Marshall Hall in 1893. So Virginians know about the shad planking down on the James River, the Wakefield shad planking steeped in politics of Virginia. That started in 1939. Okay, and the Potomac, you have these shad plankings as pictured in 1893, but down below that are 2 pictures of the DC Bar, annual meeting of the DC Bar held at Marshall Hall for their annual shad planking, 1916, the upper one, 1924. You see it's quite a diverse group of people there. But they, you can see that it was important to these folks. The shad planking was a big event every year. People came as far away as California to attend those plankings. So it was very important as the technology developed. I showed you those earlier pictures of the stuff wheeled in by horses. Well, this net deployed at Stony Point, Virginia, around the 1890s here. The net itself was almost 2 miles long. It had a sweep of 6 miles, and it took 80 men to work that net and then haul it in with a big steam powered winch. Hauled it in. So it's just huge amount of effort that went in. So you've got a population growing, you've got technology that's getting greater and greater that can harvest more fish. Shad landings, not unexpectedly, started to decline. So here you have, we don't have data pre the U.S. Fish Commission, but starting the U.S. Fish Commission in 1877, you have data and you see the decline of shad. They knew, and as I mentioned, 1877, they knew that the shad were a lot lower than they used to be. I mentioned the 22.5 million. Okay, you look at the 4 million pounds, it's a lot less in the 1870s than in the 1830s. We don't have the catch data for that other than incidental remarks. And then went down and kept declining until 1982 when the shad fishery was closed in the Potomac River. These are the young of the year. Those are adult fish captured commercially. So these are the young of year from Maryland's Chesapeake Bay wide Alsane survey. They've been doing every year since 1958, although Potomac wasn't included until 1959. But the gray bars are the young of the year from the Potomac. So we don't have the how many young of the year were there back with sort of the heyday. We have these final sort of last days. But you see from 82 when it was closed on until 94, when I started getting involved in this project, the numbers were really low and the shad were in really bad shape. So the decline of the shad is really due to these gear improvements and overfishing, but pollution was important and the loss of spawning habitat, primarily due to dams. Pollution, the Potomac is once synonymous with water pollution. You had huge fish kills in the spring in the 60s when these shad and striped bass and other fish came up to spawn, got up to the district. There was no oxygen in the water. It was so polluted. They all died in mass and were a stinking mess, an international embarrassment for the nation. Lyndon Johnson called the Potomac River a disgrace. It's one of the, the fiery Cuyahoga River, and this river and others were, one of the reasons we have the Clean Water Act. And I see this sign that's posted on the dock at Mount Vernon in 1972, don't even touch the water. I just wonder how our founding fathers, how George Washington, a person that loved the Potomac, what his spirit felt about the Potomac ending up in that shape. So the pollution was killing him. So the young, they didn't have much reproduction because of the pollution. The other thing, as I mentioned, were dams. And yeah, you get it later, you get the hydroelectric dams and stuff, but really the first dams that blocked the rivers were the canal dams, started in the 1820s. And for the Potomac, it was a little bit earlier than that. I say there's 2.5 dams in this picture, because the first dam is this curved dam right here. You see at the bottom right. And that's the dam built by the Potomac Company, that company that George Washington was the CEO of, started in the 1870s and the 1880s, and they built for that Potomac Company, most of the agricultural goods that were coming downriver just were in the middle of the river. But when they got to waterfalls, like at Great Falls, if you've been to Great Falls Park, there's a canal over on the Virginia side. Well, down here at Little Falls, just upstream from Chainbridge and upstream from the district, the entry to the canal was over here, and they would go and they'd take the canal. There was a canal that let people out where Fletcher's Boathouse is now, is where the old lock system used to go down. But in the 1820s, and the other, by the way, the other canals up at Harper's Ferry, near where I am right now, they skirted that fall line at Harper's Ferry. But the river kept getting too low in the summers. They needed something else. So 1820s, the C&O Canal. So they built 9 more dams on the Potomac. Oops, I didn't mean to go forward. And they moved this dam all the way across the river. This is the remnants, the lower little light line with a little concrete cap remaining on it right there was the C&O Canal. Went in the 1820s, and that was there until the 1930s when the C&O Canal went defunct. The railroad owned it. They traded it to the federal government. It became federal property in 1940. Again, the C&O Canal didn't become a national park until 1965. But early on, they were worried about this old historic dam breaking away, so they put a concrete cap on the top of it. You see from this little island here towards the Virginia shore on the left, the concrete cap has mostly been eroded off. There's a little piece of it right there, and this other part is still intact. Well, in the 1960s, there was a big drought, and the 3 big intakes for the Virginia, Maryland, and DC area are upstream of Great Falls. And in the 1960s, during that drought, they drank the river dry. There wasn't any water really running down through this part of the Potomac. So late 1960s, they built this long straight dam called the Brookmont Dam. This is the pumping station over on the right on the Maryland shoreline. C&O Canal, it's got a pump line that crosses the C&O Canal, and that pumps, when you have a drought, they let water run all the way down to this dam, and then it's pumped up to DeLaCarlia water treatment plant that then distributes it to DC and to Virginia suburbs. So there's sort of that dam complex. But that concrete dam, when it was just a rubble dam for the C&O Canal, the fish would get through, but when they put that concrete cap on in 1940, that stopped fish from using it. And obviously when they built this next dam in the 1960s, that was just a further obstacle. The lower left picture is that stretch of the river during a drought in 1999. You see the canal is over on the left-hand side on the Virginia shoreline. They put a fishway in here on this little island in the center of the existing dams in the 1960s. It never passed a fish because they put it in the wrong place. It should have been over here on the Virginia shoreline. This is a picture in the almost completed construction of that fishway. The fishway is a simple notch. Basically, they cut a notch in that dam. The dam's about 10 feet high, which isn't the Hoover Dam. It's not hundreds of feet high, but the migratory fish in the Chesapeake Bay, they won't jump over 2-inch obstacle. So a 10-foot is something they couldn't get over. But this notch was cut, a 28-foot wide notch, and these W-shaped weirs slow down the water, because you cut a notch and the water's going to go really fast through that notch. But these weirs slow the water down, give the fish resting places, and let them get through. That's a little artist diagram of that notch and weir system. And it worked. It works well. The fish get through. It became the front page of fish passage technology book by the American Fisheries Society. So it worked. But just getting a notch in the dam isn't enough because fish haven't been up to those waters for many decades, many generations haven't been up there. So you want to get fry back up there so they imprint to those waters. And you also we want a stocking program to help rebuild the stocks. But the Potomac the watermen are saying, we're not catching any shad. Where are you going to get shad from? We knew the population was real low. So I went up to the Susquehanna River where they were collecting shad for restoration. Can I borrow any eggs from you guys? No, we don't have any. Maryland Manning Hatchery, just 10 miles away. You guys have any extra shad? No, we don't have any extra. They had started a shad restoration on the James just a couple years before we started. I said, you have any extra? No, we don't have any extra. So I couldn't beg, borrow, or steal any eggs. Says, we got to get in the Potomac. I know how to fish nets, but I really need some experience. Where can I find the experience? Lewis Harley, Virginia waterman from Mason Neck. I went to him in '94 and talked to him, and he says, yeah, I want to help out. So Lewis and I formed a partnership, became best friends. I gave a eulogy at his funeral. I always break up a little bit. Love that man. I continue to work with his sons, Brad and Mike. I say I continue the last couple of years with COVID. Have been kind of restricted us from doing much. We're still trying to do a little bit. I noticed that Chris Lamo's one of the 10 people watching this. Chris is with the Anacostia Watershed Society, and we continue to collect shad for the student program, and Chris is in charge of that. So I'm glad you're there, Chris. And I just wanted to get a little shout out to you for keeping that program running.
Yeah, I'm very happy to be here, Jim. Thank you for the invite, and thank you for mentioning me.
No problem. And over the years, I've had hundreds of volunteers have come out. Some of you that are viewing this may have been some of my volunteers. I noticed Glenda Booth and some others are on there. I think that, and my daughter Caroline's in Minnesota watching this. So I appreciate all the volunteer help that have come out. Shad spawn at dusk and then to the dark. So we start working at dusk in the cold and chilly, April, early April, mid-April days. So I appreciate all their help. We use these drift gill nets to catch the shad. We fish off at Fort Belvoir near Dogue Creek. That's where Lewis knew to go. So we go up there, Lewis Harley knew to go. We catch the shad in these nets, the right fish we release the others, we sort of tend the nets. We keep a similar number of males because we need the sperm from the males. Here I am milking the fish, getting the eggs out of these fish into that pan. And then you we put about 5 to 10 fishes eggs into that pan, and then add 5 to 10 sperm from the males, fertilize those eggs, and then they go in a little float box that's floating just off the shore from where we're working. And just a note, the eggs, when they come out of the fish, they're kind of limp eggs. They'll start absorbing water, and they swell up to be about the size of a BB. And turn to real jewel-like, but it takes them about an hour, and you don't want to move them for an hour. So after the last fish that I milk, which sometimes might be at 11 p.m. at night, we're not moving from that site until midnight. And then we head down from Doe Creek to Mason to Halloween Point, take off there, bag the eggs, and then I drive the eggs down to Fredericksburg, hand them off to my colleagues with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then I drive back to West Virginia and get home sometimes when the sun was coming up, start the day over again. But the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would take the eggs down to Harrison Lake National Fish Hatchery down near Hopewell, Virginia, off the James, pretty far away from the Potomac. But they were there to help out. And the way this works, Dave Peterson is pouring Potomac shad eggs into this upper chamber where the fish spend about a week. They hatch in about a week. They go through a really rapid, they're fertilized egg. One day, 6 days later, they're free-flowing, free-swimming yolk sac larvae that are swimming around. When they hatch, they swim down and fall and go and swim into this big tank. And they're kept for a little bit. They tag them with the hatchery. They're tagged with a chemical to mark them as a hatchery fish. And then they take this big tank, put it on a truck, haul it up I-95 up to Great Falls Park in Virginia. Great Falls is just upstream. The river's flowing towards us in this picture, and up on the upper left is Great Falls. there's this ramp. It's an emergency access ramp for rescue operations, but we're able to use it to stock the fry. They're being stocked with this long pipe that we're changing the water. We have to acclimate them to Potomac water. So there's a process where we pump water into that tank for a while, and then it's all released, and they're released in this. And in the 8-year stocking program from 1995 till 2002, we stocked 17 million shad fry. And by 2002, the Potomac population had made a comeback already. We quit doing the restoration stocking, but the Potomac then, where it was a river that I couldn't beg, borrow, or steal any eggs from anybody, well, it became the egg source for the Susquehanna River, all of the Maryland rivers, and the Rappahannock River in Virginia, and eventually down the road a few years, it became the egg source for the James River. So from 2003 to 2014, I worked with the Interstate Commission again to help Virginia Game and Inland Fisheries collect American shad broodstock for the Rappahannock River. Along with us in the river now were biologists from Maryland collecting fish, from the Susquehanna collecting fish. But for the Rappahannock, we stocked 48 million shad fry into the Rappahannock, and we stocked 5 million into the Potomac River from 2003 to 2014. Because as I said, when we take these fish out to get their eggs, they die from that process. Herring don't handle very well. They're not like salmon or other fish. So when we're using fish from the Potomac to get eggs for the other river, to be conservative, we do what's called a replacement stocking. All those other programs, they would stock an estimated 10% of the fry back into the Potomac so that it would replace the fish that were being killed to let them have their fish. Another byproduct, we're starting in 1996, we started having schools involved. We designed a small tank. It's right over here in the middle right side. See students looking in there. There's a little egg chamber. We put about half a quart of, a couple cups of shad eggs in there. And then they would hatch in that tank and then fall in this bigger tub. And then the school groups would take them down to the river, to the Potomac River, and use cups, and we'd have a sort of a mass release as they released their fry. When I say fry, you might think of like a trout fingerling. No, these are fry. Basically, the best description I have for them is done by the students. They're 2 eyes and a wiggle. They're about the size of mosquito larvae, but that's what really works best for shad stocking, is not to try to grow them to fingerlings, because they're schooling fish. The typical hatcheries like you have for trout don't work for shad. You get them back into the river as soon as you can. We have these students out. It's a great reward. The students, tens of thousands of students from the Washington area, released over 900,000 fry in their classrooms in this replacement stocking. Here's a map of the schools that were involved in 1 year. We had 54 schools. So that included South County was a school we had for many years, and Gunston Elementary School close by to you guys. So we had a lot of schools involved. You can imagine some of those schools would be all of the 4th grade classes had a tank. There'd be 4 tanks, 5 tanks in the school. So we had a lot of students involved. It's very rewarding. All right, now I promised you an intermission. I call it an interfish on. We're going to take a little bit of a break. When we return, I'm going to describe what's happened to the Potomac shad population after all this work. So we'll have, I guess, a 5 or 10 minute break. Tom or Pam, you know what the time limit is on this? I think we said 10 minutes.
Yeah, it's going to be just 5 minutes probably is about it.
Okay.
So if you could stop sharing for a moment, Jim, we'll need to bring up another slide. Okay, thank you. 2 questions have come up so far, which I'd like to get to before we go on to the rest of our break. A question was raised, are hickory shad also filter feeders just like the American shad?
All right. Our cousin to the American shad, they're all herring, and they're all the herring and shad are filter feeders, just like that. They all have that same kind of mechanism with their gill rakers or the net they use to catch their plankton that they're eating. Good question.
Okay, and another question, did shad used to enter the Great Lakes before the St. Lawrence Seaway was built? Did they get up that far?
No, they didn't get up that far. You know, when they built the Erie Canal, they did introduce herring, river herring, got up to, let me back up a little bit. So the shad are main stem river spawners. You know, they're the herring that spawn in the big rivers. The smaller tributaries are what they call river herring. They go up into those smaller tributaries. They'll go up into streams that, I've seen a stream down in Virginia Beach where I kind of went to high school. There was a stream there in a back swamp, and I think that stream was a 1.5 feet wide, maybe 4 inches deep, and there were herring running up it. So they go way up small tributaries to spawn, but the American shad pretty much stays in the main stem. And they'll go up to bigger rivers like the Occoquan. They probably went further up in the Occoquan than they could go now because of the dam there. And the Anacostia, they go up in the Anacostia pretty far. But then once they get into the ones that starts getting constricted, then the river herring are the ones that move further up.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn the program over now for the next couple of minutes to one of the interpreters for Mason Neck State Park. Here we are. Okay, this is Casey Early, who is one of our very skilled interpreters at the park, who's going to talk about what's going on coming up at the park. Casey?
Hello, can you hear me all right?
Just fine.
Awesome. This is a wonderful presentation. I'm very fascinated. So this year at the park, we are doing some of our usual activities, and we are bringing in some new activities. So you can see on the slide there, April 22nd is Earth Day. This year, the international theme for Earth Day is Invest in Our Planet. And so the way that we're going to be investing in the planet this year is by planting some native plants here at the park. We have about 3 different planting areas picked out. We haven't decided on exactly which one we're going to use, but we're going to be ordering native wildflower seeds, and guests will be able to come and help us plant some of these seeds. And in doing so, they will be educated on the importance of using native plants, how to set up a wildlife-friendly garden, and learn about the different types of pollinators that they can attract to their gardens, and just generally how they can support wildlife, even just in their own, suburban front yard garden. And then, of course, on May 7th is going to be our annual Eagle Festival. I know you guys have been there very frequently. I'm sure one of you is in that frog costume in the picture right there. So the Eagle Festival is an all-day event that features booths from different environmental and outdoor organizations. I believe the Girl Scouts might be there, the Boy Scouts are planning to be there. And one of the big attractions is always the live animal shows. There are several different rescue organizations and educational organizations that we often work with. One of them is Secret Garden Birds and Bees. They came and brought some owls to our owl program this last year. And so they're going to have a tent with different animal shows. Typically we have like a reptile show, there might be a mammal show. Frequently they bring raptors. I remember last year they had a gorgeous barred owl. And so that's very exciting. People come here to the park and often they get to see the eagles, but you don't necessarily get to see them up close like that. And then of course we typically have live music. Sometimes there are food trucks, all kinds of fun things like that. So that's a great way to kind of reach out and connect to the not only the local community, but the other organizations in the area as well. And then another new event that we're going to be doing is a Kids to Parks Day fun run on May 21st. So May 21st is Kids to Parks Day, focused on getting children out into the outdoors and especially to their local parks and their local green spaces. And so what we're going to do is have a fun run. There will be multiple length options, and there are also going to be other activities. We're hoping to maybe have a popcorn machine and a snow cone machine. No, we haven't fully ironed that out yet, but it is going to be a good time, and I think it's going to be a great opportunity for families to get out and not only exercise, but just spend some time outside in general. And it's not on this slide, but one thing that we are really looking forward to is our Grasses for the Masses Planting Day. So Grasses for the Masses is the program run by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation in the previous years, and they have now turned it over to us. And so what we do in this program is we help people to raise underwater wild celery grasses, and they usually get a nice big kit. We supply all the equipment, and guests can come and take these kits home and raise these underwater grasses in their own houses. We get a lot of schools that come and do it in their different classrooms. And then in May, I want to say 27th, everybody brings their adult grasses back to the park, and we all wade out into the Belmont Bay and plant those grasses. And so that is very good for not only removing CO2 from the environment, but also providing shelter for a lot of small animals, such as baby fish and all the other kinds of aquatic creatures that we have living out there, so that they can grow up and go about populating the bay. And then we also, of course, have our winter waterfowl that come down here, and they, along with many other animals, will see these plants as a source of food. So that's been pretty successful this year, and it's going to be very exciting once we've got all those adult plants ready to go back out into the water. And the other thing that we are looking forward to this year is bringing back the Youth Conservation Corps and the AmeriCorps. Youth Conservation Corps is something that has really helped us out a lot in the past. We get a lot of young people that come out here. They spend about a week or two out here at the park, and they do things like help to repair trails. They help to build new fences. They do a lot of sort of odd jobs around the park, and it's a good experience for them, and it's very helpful for us. And then something similar is our AmeriCorps staff, who come out here and train and help in different areas of the park as well. So we're looking forward to working with those two organizations again. So I think this is going to be shaping up to be a beautiful spring. It's going to be a great year here at the park.
Okay, thanks very much, Casey.
Thank you.
Yeah. Jim, you ready to go again?
I'm ready. And while I'm switching and sharing my screen, everybody hearing me okay and everything?
Everything's fine, Jim.
Going well?
Yeah, everything's
Oh,
fine.
good. Good. I didn't know if I'm talking too fast or whatever, so glad to hear that everything's going all right. All right. Now we go to the full screen. Okay. Okay, so what's happened to the Potomac shad population? Big question. And just a second before I go any further, Casey, I appreciate that. I've got a recommendation for a native plant that's really good. It's a small tree. It gets to be about 10 feet tall. The shad bush, Amelanchier, which is great wildlife food. Birds like it, a lot of things like it, and it flowers early. It's called shad bush because it's one of the first things to flower before dogwoods even, and it is marking the arrival of shad in the coastal areas. It's called serviceberry out where I live because it was something they used when they had the funerals in the spring when they could thaw out the ground and dig graves. But at any rate, just a little recommendation on the shad bush. I'm digressing too much there. Okay, how are they doing? Well, it depends on who you ask. The Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, which is in charge of managing our coastal, these multi-state stocks, they do every decade or so, they do a assessment of how well the stock is running. They released their report in 2020, and in their report, they said specifically adult mortality was determined to be unsustainable for the Connecticut, Delaware, and Potomac. I had commented to them because if you look down at their data down below in that blue box, you'll see the young of the year, there was no trend. The adults, there were no trends. Look at the years they looked at, 2005 to 2017. I'll illustrate why I've called your attention to those years in a bit. But they have the total mortality that is unsustainable. Even though not only when they had me, I was retired, but they asked me to review it. So I was reviewing, saying, this is not right. You're not doing this right. And their own peer review panel's recommendation is that the data they were using, they had data quality issues that were such a concern that the model should not be used to provide estimates for management purposes. I underline that. That's a quote from their thing. So in other words, if you looked at the report and read it, the Potomac shad population may or may not be sustainable according to their data. But they said to be conservative, we're going to emphasize it may not be sustainable. This was in my earlier communications. Okay, what does their press release says? It says was determined to be unsustainable. So anyway, you can tell I've got issues with the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission stock assessment issues. Let's hear what the shad have to say. Okay, the fishway at Little Falls, it works. This is Mike Odom, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service partner. We were assigned to monitor the shad going up to Great Falls. Again, the fishway was put in 2000 in January, so that spring we captured 3 fish. We tried a bunch of different methods. We had electrofishing boats, really hard to get into this area of the river, gill netting from canoes, a lot of things. We finally settled on these dip nets like the guys were using back in the early 1900s to dip for shad. Well, the first year we've got 3 in our survey. The next year 12, the following year 43, all was looking great. Then the Fish and Wildlife Service's budget was cut. We couldn't go on, so we don't have information for going up to Great Falls with that survey we were doing past that date. However, on the Virginia side at the overlooks, the visitors were coming there and saying, what are all these fish we're seeing in the river? So the National Park Service put up this little explanation saying what you're seeing below and above, because the birds are feeding on these fish, are the American shad coming up here. So even though we weren't monitoring, they were being seen by folks. We know it works. Okay, remember this slide I showed earlier of the young of the year when we started, 95. This is the period we were looking at. 1982 was closed, and these gray bars are the Potomac. We're hoping to get back to the 1970s or so. It was optimistic because we didn't know if we'd even find any fish. Okay, the bottom of your screen, you so up to from that earlier date to 2021. So what I was showing you is this bottom left-hand side. That's the old young of the year numbers. Over to the right-hand side are the new young of the year numbers. Again, this is Maryland's DNR's Shore Haul Seine survey. I mentioned that the survey started in 2005, which my cursor is pointing to 2005 there, and it went to 2017, and they will use like blinders on. So yeah, in 2017, the numbers are a little bit lower, and you see it jumps around. That's sort of natural to shad. But what is the trend? What trend do you see there? Do you see it declining? They even had these last numbers when they did the 2020 report. They had this 2019 number. But they just, again, I think they use their blinders when they're using this thing. So the young of the year are increasing in numbers very well. For the last 20 years, we've eclipsed those 1970s numbers. We're doing well on young of the year in that survey. Again, they closed the commercial fishery down in 82, so I needed some adult numbers. Fortunately, Maryland started doing the striped bass survey, and they use multi-mesh gill nets. Put out is much more scientific than our brood collection. We're collecting one size fish. Anyway, they did the adult numbers starting in 96. And you see also, bounces up and down, but you see how the numbers have continued to increase since they started the survey in 1996. The commercial pound net fisheries are the official statistics used by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. Down on at the bottom left, you see what numbers they got back in the 40s and 50s. That created that solid blue line going across. That was a restoration target. Again, in the middle of the diagram, you see the Potomac River Fisheries Commission numbers they had for those, because again, they only had a few years, 5 years worth of data. In 1983, it was closed down. So we didn't have any data from the commercial fisheries until 1999, when they started collecting, noting their bycatch, what they caught in their nets. They weren't allowed to keep any shad. The fish that they caught in their nets died, but they had to just throw them overboard. They weren't allowed to keep them. That changed after the 2002 when we numbers popped up. We let them keep their bycatch. But this is the number of the shad that they're catching, and you see that. Does that look like a decline to you? The blue line, we've surpassed that. Green line is the geometric mean of the data from when it started in 2000. This is what the Atlantic States Fisheries Commission forces us to use. But that green line has risen up from being real low in the first few years, it rose up and exceeded that blue line in 2012. So the Potomac River Fishery Commission reopened the shad fishery. So since 2012, you go to a supermarket, you might be buying Potomac origin shad, although we kept it real conservative. It's just this bycatch they're basically catching. But you see the numbers going up. So again, I think the shad are telling us they're doing okay. The other one, the most fun way to monitor is hook and line, and the number of fishermen fishing for them up in the District of Columbia is greatly increased. It's just a big place. You can't rent a boat up there in the spring. People come from all over the country to go fishing up there. I will mention shad plankings, bringing back that. There's Lewis, Harley, and I. Shad planking we had for years up at Fletcher's Boathouse. I do smoke some of these at my home smoker. They're really good. This is the Wakefield, Virginia shad planking, the one that's sort of steeped in the politics of Virginia. They closed that down the last couple of years because of the fishery was closed in the James River. I'm just showing you some of these other, the Maryland, Vienna, Maryland, Catskills, different ways that they prepare them, Lambertville. And then again, that old picture of 1893 up at Marshall Hall, just shad planking. We kind of bring that back. But the stories for shad restoration is not over. I told the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission it's continuing to rise, but the Potomac's not really in near full recovery. It needs a lot more to recover. But Potomac's one of the few rivers along the entire East Coast that's doing anywhere near well, that's seeing improvement. Almost all of the other rivers from Florida up through Maine are at historic low numbers. They've never been this low. So that means that there's not many adult shad from that population going out into the ocean. So the Potomac adult fish, when they're out in the ocean being preyed upon, they're being preyed upon heavily. So their real restoration and recovery of the Potomac shad won't happen the way I really want it to happen until these other rivers are restored. So you have more adult shad so that they're not, Potomac shad aren't the only ones to eat out in the ocean. So that's what I told the ASMFC. And I'm supporting other river restorations, coastwide. We need more shad out there. So that's the end of my talk on the shad. Oh, I mentioned that the school programs, again, the schools are still involved because they're helping with this replacement stocking to replace, since 2002, they've been helping to replace the shad that are taken for these other fisheries programs that have kind of been curtailed the last 2 years. But I talked with Chris Lamo. We're going to try to do some other stuff this year. We'd love it sort of online, showing the students, but we still have a number of schools involved. I think 30-some schools that want to be at least seeing the online stuff. And a few of them are going to be raising shad in their classrooms. Hopefully, we'll get out and be able to collect them this year. Again, a lot of with COVID stuff, the school stuff's kind of uncertain, but the teachers really love the program. They say that students learn more because they're not just learning about how to raise shad. They're doing math. They have to estimate how many fry they have. They're doing history. They're doing all kinds. They're doing presentations. We have 5th grade classes that give a slideshow to the 2nd graders in their school about the shad stuff they're doing. So they learn how to do presentations. They do it all enthusiastically. It's a great program. One of the environmental educators, Sandy Burke, wrote a book, Let the River Run Silver Again, for elementary schools. It's an award-winning book, as you see below. It's cited by the National Science Teachers Association as one of the best available supplements for science teaching. A documentary film, Shad Run, was made in 2018. It's shown a lot. It's done real well. It's a half an hour. You can get this. All you need to do for this one is just Google Shad Run, the movie, and you can get a link to watch this. It's about a 25-minute long film. It sort of highlights the student program, which is real important. I've gotten awards, as mentioned earlier, Heroes of Conservation. Governor Mark Warner gave me an award in 24. The project was noted in a synthesis looking all around the country at the different projects people are doing, was one of the top 25 for its range of groups involved in the monitoring. The National Fish Habitat Action Plan of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service says this is the type of partnership we want to have all through the country. Actually, the brook trout initiative is modeled after us. In 2004, Secretary of the Interior Gail Norton came out to the river to see me and give me a What's a Glass award, but gave me an award. And as was mentioned earlier, well, in 2006, I got this Future of Fishing Award. The American Sports Fishing Association is made up of tackle manufacturers, Bass Pro, Cabela's, lots of different fishing equipment, boats. It's a big industry. They only give one award a year. They gave it to me for, these kids that are involved, Future of Fishing. I'm sitting there next to Congressman John Dingell. Since that time, he's passed, but he and his father have done a lot for fish conservation and restoration. Best reward for me is a change in appreciation of the fish. This Anacostia shad, a glass mosaic by Valerie Theberg, installed up at skate park in Hyattsville, Maryland. She was one of the volunteers that came out on the American Shad collections. And for me, who started the DC Fisheries Program in 1985, in 2017, the American Shad became the state fish of the District of Columbia. Very good rewards. And in 2019, I got to put this one up, Jamie Raskin came again to the banks of the Potomac, surprised me, gave me a Lifetime Achievement Award with this paddle from Fletcher's Boathouse. Again, I started the DC Fisheries Program talking with the Fletcher's brothers in 1984. I said, I really want to bring back American Shad. So that's why I got that. And also I feel a little more proud than even United States presidents and Jamie Raskin. I feel prouder than some presidents. Anyway, I had to have that one. But now I'm going to focus on the Mason Neck. As I've showed you some pictures, and it says Shad Fisheries, Stony Point, Potomac River. So there you see one, Shad, Stony Point, Potomac River. And many of them are labeled as such. Where was Stony Point on the Potomac? I had a feeling it was in Mason Neck, but it doesn't say Mason Neck. It says Stony Point, Potomac River. When I looked around for where Stony Point, the only Stony Point I could find with Googling was near Colonial Beach, Virginia, just upstream from that on the Virginia side. But at Colonial Beach, the river is about 3 miles separating. You're looking at the Maryland shoreline in the distance. That doesn't look like 3 miles there, so that's not the Stony Point. Well, in 2009, I gave a talk at Gunston Hall on Shad. I met two gentlemen, Jerry Lyons and Gary Nippling from Mason Neck, who we all shared this interest in the Mason Neck fisheries. They hadn't seen these photographs that I had, but what they had that I hadn't seen, they had maps made during the Civil War that's revealed the location of Stony Point. Well, this map here, 1862 map, you see Mason Neck, you got High Point, you got Howling Point, Low Point, it's kind of covered by my little green outline, and there's Stony Point, right there. Oh, that was just wonderful to find out where it was. This is 1864 map. I don't know the person who drew this. It's in a collection of maps from that time. And there you see the High Point, Howling Point, Low Point, and you see Stony Point right there on this projection going out into the river. There's a road coming down to it to Stony Point. Okay. Hey, I said, when I look at this map, I think it's something else. Well, has the shoreline eroded that much since 1864? Because it doesn't look like that now. So I wondered about that as sort of an aside. Well, I found another 1864 map. This one I found on my own. It's done by the USGS Coastal Survey, looking at mainly the bathymetry of the Potomac River. But look how wonderfully accurate this map is. There's Howling Point. There's High Point. There's Sycamore Point, which used to be Low Point. It doesn't label the Stony Point, though. But look how accurate it is compared to a satellite image of that same stretch. It's almost identical. It's almost identical. So those guys were really good, considering they never were even up in a balloon, most of them, to look down and to be able to map it that accurately is pretty incredible. So it hadn't changed that much. It hadn't eroded. Another thing I call your attention to the satellite map, though, is if you look down, I hope you can see this, there's a road, Anchorage Road, that goes down to the river still. I'm pretty sure that's the road they were showing in that map. And the Stony Point, I figured, was this point coming out right here to the left, to the downstream side of where that road comes out. They needed that road there to bring all these shad, take them to market. So that's where I think Stony Point is. So I went out in 2011 with Brad Harley, Gary Nippling, Jerry Lyons wasn't able to go out with us that time, but we went out. It ended up being a high tide, unfortunately. But I wanted to get the same perspective. So this bottom left picture, I think I'm pretty much the same perspective. The trees have grown back. If you've ever seen photographs from the 1800s, late 1800s Civil War, we really hated trees back in that period. There weren't many trees. And, the trees have grown back. So that's the image I took at the bottom left, looking at what I feel was similar to that image. I want to be there at low tide. If I turned around, I took the picture to the bottom right. That's what I think is Stony Point. That picture at the upper thing there is that place where they had the steam engine to haul in the net. That's that Stony Point fishery there. I think it's there. Well, we went up to, I've blown up that picture a little bit. You notice there's a brick wall in that, and this was a steam and powered winch in here. Well, when you have that heat, you want to have fire bricks. These yellow bricks are fire bricks. Those are two of the bricks that were in this vicinity. That point I was showing you right here, there's red bricks and fire bricks right there. I think that's what's remaining of that old Stony Point fishery. I was pretty excited about finding that. Mason Neck goes way back in time. This is the downstream side of that same, so the brick walls on the far side of this view. We're looking from downstream up at that project, but look at this picture drawn by David Hunter Strother, who went by Port Crayon, who was widely used in Harper's Weekly in the 1850s Civil War period. He became a Union officer. He's from Martinsburg. He drew this picture of Night Hall. I'm pretty sure, look at that shoreline over there and that shoreline up there. He was drawing the horse-drawn take up of the nets at that same location in 1861. So there's a lot of history there at Stony Point, including from up near where I live, folks that came down from Martinsburg to draw that picture. At Howling Drive Landing, this is where the Harleys have their access to the river. This picture to the upper left, you'll see in the background, you'll see Fort Belvoir land in the back. And then just beyond that, where it narrows down and gets kind of shallow, that's where Doe Creek comes in. You're seeing some of that Mount Vernon area. But these are this is 1890 photographs of the guys getting their shad nets ready. This is on the right, it's 2016. I'm taking a picture of the crew out that day. You'll see that same setting. You see the Fort Belvoir in the back and Mount Vernon, that's Doe Creek in that area. It's harder to see with that boat dock there, but where we put in and where the Harleys have, fished commercially for generations, that's where it is. In fact, if you look up at the upper right, you see this sort of a wooden building. You see that structure there. It's in the bottom picture, that structure's to the center right, and you see some folks drying nets. I'm pretty sure there's probably some Harleys drying some nets. Just so you know, we've got people engaged. These are one of the crews that came out with us in 2014. Scott Surville on the far left, Rob Hartwell, Liz Hartwell's son, Delegate Jason Miller and his son, Jason Miller Jr. These are the Harley brothers. Brad and Mike, Chris is Brad's son, a helper, Rusty Zappello, your delegate David Ramadan, and myself. You've got people kind of lined up to help you if you want to do some additional interpretations and stuff at that site for Howling Point. Take-home lessons, I'll skip a lot of these, but recalling our past provides insights for the future. So I wanted you to thank you for having me. I'm ready to take questions. I look forward to future work with you all on interpretation and stuff on that Stony Point. I hope you want to do that as well. And that concludes my talk. So I'm going to leave it open in case I'm going to go down. I'm going to get out of this view mode so I can, if people have questions, I can go back to particular slides if they have a question about a particular slide. So I'm open for any kind of questions, discussion, comments.
Okay.
Don't hold back.
Thank you very much, Jim. This was really fascinating, and I just loved the way you brought us this home to Mason Neck, the area where we have the park and the wildlife refuge, and all the way up to Howling Point, where people live now. was a huge, huge area for fisheries. That's great. I would suggest if anybody would like to unmute and ask Jim a question or make a comment, now would be a good time to do it. We don't have any questions on the chat. So if anybody would like to raise anything, please go right ahead.
The difference in the different shad, hickory shad, American shad?
Difference, well, the American shad are bigger. Hickory shad and all of that, the river herring and the American shad and the hickory shad, they come up and migrate at different times. There's an overlap in them, but hickory shad kind of come up a little bit earlier than the American shad, and they don't. They're smaller. They're called their scientific name is mediocre. They weren't considered to taste that good. So some people, a lot of people don't, they wanted the American shad. They didn't care that much for the hickory shad, but that varies. I mean, tastes differ. There are people that like to eat the hickory shad as well, but historically, it's the American shad's the favorite shad, the most delicious shad in the world, delicious herring in the world. And again, the river herring are smaller than the hickory shad. They come up and spawn in these tributaries. The alewife river herring comes up first, and then the blueback river herring comes up second. There's overlap in these, but there is a sort of a timing that's involved with those. But they're all filter feeders. None of them eat anything while they're up here spawning in the freshwater portions of the river. And that part of the river off of Mason Neck in the springtime is all freshwater. You don't get the salt wedge till way down. Now in the summertime, the salt wedge will move way up, and then in the droughts, the young of the year shad don't like to go into that salt wedge. So when you have a drought and the salt wedge moves way upstream, the young of the year are kind of forced up towards the District of Columbia area. And real wet years, the young of the year move way down. That's why some of that variation, the annual variation in the shore haul seines that Maryland does, is because of where that salt wedge is. If you get a really wet year, they tend to have a really good number. You get a really dry year, and they don't get many fish at their sites that they're looking at, because where they're looking is downstream about 10 miles from Mason Neck is where they're doing their haul seine, their most upstream haul seine survey.
Okay, Jim, Susan Laum has raised her hand. Susan, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim, for your presentation. You probably catch your own fish. I saw you smoking them there. Could you recommend a place where we can find smoked shad in a retail place these days?
I don't know of any place you can get smoked shad. A lot of the grocery stores now are selling American shad in the spring. You can get the roe is the primary thing that you'll find, and there again, maybe $13 at the cheapest to $17 or more. I don't know right around Mason. I don't shop in your area, but I know around there's places all around the metropolitan Washington area that sell them. Getting the smoked shad, you're probably going to need to do that yourself. And I basically fillet them just like I'd fillet any fish. Now, the shad are known for their many bones. In fact, the Algonquin name for the shad is Tatamaho, which means inside-out porcupine, because of all the bones that were in them. The legend was that there was a porcupine that wasn't happy with his life, didn't have many friends, nobody really wanted to hug him or anything. So he petitioned the Great Spirit to, can I be something else? Can you make me something else? And she said, sure, I'll make you into something else. So she turned the porcupine inside out, made him a fish that had to swim its entire life. The shad never stopped swimming from the moment they hatch until they die. And they have to go to these, go up rivers to spawn. You got to go out in the ocean to live. Kind of made it tough on them. I guess the lesson that they were teaching was be happy with who or what you are. But that's the Tatamaho, the inside out. And so those bones are kind of difficult, but when you smoke the fish, it's easy to, you don't have to, there are people that can debone the shad, which they call boning the shad. Doesn't sound right. You're boning the shad, act like you're adding bones, but boning is the deboning of shad. But there are not many people that know how to do that anymore. That's a skill that has gone with the demise of shad. You can get it, but it's hard to get. Most of what you get in the store are going to be like a whole shad that you can bake slowly to help dissolve some of the bones. But I just fillet them like a regular fish. put that it gets rid of the rib bones and the vertebrae bones, but these little Y bones that come off of the vertebrae of the shad that other fish don't have, they're small little, and they're soft boned fishes. And by smoking them, it doesn't dissolve those bones, but you can peel off the bones really easy. My wife Nancy really loves smoked shad, and when I give her a half of a fillet of the shad, all that's left when she's done is this little pile of white bones. I mean, she just is really fastidious about getting.
Jim, we have 4 questions in the chat and 1 person with a hand up. So let's see if we can run through them real quick before we run into folks' dinner times or whatever here, okay?
Yeah, sure.
First question. Person says they've seen a commercial fishing net on Belmont Bay just below the visitor center at the park. What kind of fishing is going on there? Do you know?
The main fishery right now in your area is the blue cat fishery. That's probably what you're seeing. They also, in the springtime, you have rockfish, striped bass fishing. The Harleys for generations before, the blue cat really came into the Potomac mid-1980s and has kind of taken over the river. I mean, there's more blue catfish harvested in the Potomac River than rockfish in the entire Chesapeake Bay. So, I mean, it's really a big fishery. And the blue catfish taste really good, so eat them up because they don't really, they're not native to the Potomac. There might be an impact on the American shad, although we're not really seeing it up in the upper areas here. All right, next question.
Second question. How does the fertilizer runoff and algae growth affect the shad?
Yeah, that hurt them. And again, the Potomac River used to be green in Mason Neck area. Rob Hartwell used to be one of our commissioners on the Interstate Commission. And he, a lot of people I've met around Mason Neck who grew up in the 60s, 70s, remember when it was just, you could go down and write your name in the algae in the Potomac. So yeah, we've reduced with mainly through wastewater treatment plant upgrades from the 60s when they was, basically raw sewage with chlorine in it would be dumped in the river to where now it's pretty clean. And the river is really a lot different. I would not have been able to restore shad without the cleanup that occurred at the Potomac River.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
it's a lot better.
Next question. How's the shad restoration on the Connecticut River? Is it worse than Potomac?
I'm not really that current on that. I hesitate to comment on that. I don't know that in particular. I have to look that up myself.
Okay. All right. Are there restoration programs for any of the other filter feeders on the Potomac?
You mean the fish filter feeders? Because
Yes.
oysters are filter feeders as well.
Yeah.
And there are some, I think, some restoration efforts. Again, we have the diseases, MSX and Dermo, that are affecting oysters. But the river herring, yeah, there's an effort to try to work on restoring river herring. I worked on river herring as well as American shad on Rock Creek Park and up in the Anacostia watersheds, and we were seeing some gains there. The problem is there's this intercept fishery on these fish, as I mentioned, go out into the ocean. The herring go out in the ocean. The shad and herring spend 90% of their life in the ocean, and when they're up around the New England area, there's a fishery up there. It's called the lobster bait fishery. It's the Atlantic. It's supposed to be Atlantic herring, but they go out with these big nets and scoop up schools of fish to turn it into lobster bait. Because the only way you can have as many lobsters as we have to supply all the red lobster houses all across the country are to artificially feed those lobsters food from the ocean, and that includes river herring and American shad because they're not really paying attention. That's why I think the ASMFC had that thing with me, because I was commenting on their Atlantic fisheries thing saying, hey, we know they're catching American shad and river herring in that fishery. Why aren't you closing that down?
Yeah.
And I think that this thing, but okay, sorry, I can digress really easily on all these. Next question.
And Glenda Booth had raised her hand. Glenda, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Glenda.
Hi, Jim. It's great to reconnect. And you gave me credit for volunteering with you. I mostly watched, but that was a wonderful day just to watch Jim at work extruding eggs. Is that the right term? Is that what you did?
Yeah, that's a fine term for it. But I think the most important task for volunteers is writing down what we were catching, because my hands are all slimy and wet, really bad note takers. So having people to take notes and helping me take fish out, but taking notes was the most important task. So,
Well,
yeah,
and
go ahead.
actually, I wrote an article about all of that, and I'm going to write another one, and I'll talk to you later about that. What I'd like to ask is, can you just clarify your conclusion about the population trends in the Potomac? I know you have concerns about the Atlantic States Fishery Commission data, but you know, if you had to say in two sentences, you know, what are the current population trends? You talked about juveniles, but it wasn't clear to me that overall that the
Well, I think
populations are rising.
Well, I think I'm still sharing screen, right? You're looking at a couple of slides of mine.
Yes.
Okay, if you look at the young of the year slide, you're talking about the juveniles. There's one showing, I mean, that's huge compared to what it was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Right.
That's doing well. This adult shad numbers that are caught by Maryland, it's non-fisheries related. They're random nets they put out. It's a really good program, that Maryland DNR, but that's a trend going up. This is the commercial watermen. Again, that's what it was in the 1980s. We're way down at the bottom in the middle. And look at that line going up. I say they're all trending up. You can't do an estimate of the numbers because the rivers are open systems. The number of shad in the river any given day changes. Some are out migrating, some are coming in. So you can't do population estimates. All you can really do, I think, reliable ones. There are people that have these complicated math models, but I don't trust them. I think it's more important that you look at the trends that are going on, and you see these statistics are showing the trends going up. It's not plateauing. It's not going down. It's not going up the way I think it could, as I mentioned, but it's still going up.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, very good. I think we'll bring this to a close at this point. I thank you very much, Jim, for bringing this information to us.